Hi, I know, I know.
It's kind of like old friends, right?
It's like a reading.
Yeah,
Um,
that's the most generous spokesman we ever had.
Flattery will get you everywhere, Benny. You know.
no, I'm not going to sit here, please. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Today we have the pleasure of having Ambassador Wood, who apparently many of you know, which is great. He is our U.S. Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament and also the U.S. Special Representative for Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention issues. I'm going to hand it over to him. He'll give a few opening remarks, then we'll turn it over to questions. Everything here is on the record. As you are asking the question, if you can just identify yourself and your news agency so that he knows who he's talking to if he doesn't already. And with that, Ambassador Wood.
Great. Well, thanks, and thanks for coming in this morning. It's great to be back here in New York, my hometown. Wonderful. Let me start off saying this first committee, the first committee is always combative for a whole number of reasons. But this one, I think, was not only very combative, but also from the U.S. perspective, very, very productive. We saw in that hall, conference room 4, throughout the entire 5-week period, a growing condemnation and growing isolation of North Korea, which was important. A number of countries who hadn't previously spoken out about North Korea and its provocative acts did. Later this morning, we are going to, there's a plan to vote on what I believe is one of the toughest First Committee resolutions that we've had on the chemical weapons issue with regard to Syria. So we expect that there will be a huge majority in support of this resolution, which condemns the acts that the Syrian regime is engaged in and also calls for accountability from the regime. Two last points. The other big success from our standpoint was the overwhelming support for the Japanese United for Action resolution, which had very strong condemnation of North Korea, but also, I think, was a perfect snapshot of where the entire nonproliferation disarmament community is right now with regard to the issue of nuclear disarmament. And frankly, there was a growing understanding of, if you look at the numbers that voted for this resolution, it was 44, yeah, 144, 4 against 27 abstentions. But it was clearly represented a growing understanding that future disarmament has to be conditions-based, meaning you can't divorce nuclear disarmament from the prevailing security environment. Last point I'll make is about the U.S.'s triennial resolution on compliance with with disarmament, nonproliferation agreements. We got 165 votes for, 1 against, that being North Korea, 11 abstentions. And we thought that was a very, very powerful message that was sent about the importance of compliance with resolutions. In fact, we had more co-sponsors this year than we've ever had. And so from the U.S. standpoint, as I said, this was a very, I think, productive and successful first committee, although we still have the Syria chemical weapons piece to do later this morning. So I'm going to stop there and take your questions.
Ambassador Wood, on you know who I am.
I know you very well.
On the issue of nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament, the new nuclear treaty, do you think that played into what you were talking about as the very combative atmosphere? What impact did that have?
Well, no, it's a very good question, Edie. I think it had a big impact on the nature of the discourse this year. It was, as I said, much more combative. This treaty has been extremely divisive within the disarmament and nonproliferation community. And I think, again, if you look at the number of votes for the Japanese resolution, in my view, this is the new baseline. where there is a clear understanding from majority of countries that were present at First Committee that you can no longer, given the situation that we have with regard to North Korea, with Russian behavior around the world, Chinese efforts in the South China Sea, the conditions are not ripe for nuclear disarmament at this point. We need to create those conditions that can bring about further disarmament. But this ban treaty has been extremely divisive, and it has absolutely no practical impact on nuclear disarmament. We will not reduce global stockpiles by one single weapon because of this treaty. And it was basically, this is, the treaty's proponents have ignored the importance of having the right conditions for disarmament. They have basically said nuclear deterrence is obsolete. They seem to want to ignore the very difficult security environment that we are dealing with today. So, in short, to answer your question, yes, it had a role in further polarizing and aggravating an already difficult environment at First Committee.
So,
I know you.
you mentioned North Korea, you mentioned Syria, you mentioned even Russia and China and South China Sea. You didn't mention Iran, which is a big issue in non-proliferation. Specifically, this may not be First Committee, but it has to do with disarmament. Does the U.S. have any clear indication about cooperation between Iran and North Korea beyond the resemblance in missiles and presence in?
No, I don't, Benny, but again, by not mentioning Iran in no way indicates any lessening of a concern about Iran. Iran's behavior, malign behavior around the world is known. You know, you saw the president's steps that he took with regard to the JCPOA. We are greatly concerned about what they're doing in many regions around the world, not just the Middle East, but I don't have any other information with regard to how they may be working with North Korea, providing them any type of support, whether it be military or otherwise. I just don't know that.
And the JCPOA, is that part of the, I mean, does that put Iran on the shelf? Because there is a JCPOA, we don't have to deal with it anymore? Is that how it works?
What the president said very clearly is that the benefits that were gained from this agreement are not in sync with what Iran was required to do. And so the president wants the agreement fixed, and he wants to work with Congress and our other partners to fix the agreement because it doesn't address some of these issues like what Iran is doing with regard to ballistic missile activity, what their support for Hezbollah, for Hamas, their constant verbal attacks on Israel. These things were not dealt with under that agreement, and we frankly think that they need to be dealt with, and we will do what we can to deal with these issues. So Iran is its behaviors of great concern, and we'll be working with our allies and others to try to roll that back as best we can.
But the question is, in the context of the First Committee, the UN environment, all that, you have all the Europeans are saying, no, JCPOA is dealing with it, it's working, don't even go there. You have, obviously, Chinese and Russians even more aggressive about that. So, I mean, is the international arena a place to deal with that at all, or is that
To deal with
fixing the JCPOA?
Well, look, the president decertified under U.S. law, not under the JCPOA. What happens to the JCPOA in the future will be, that's still to be determined. But we are going to obviously try to deal with Iran's malign behavior in every way that we possibly can, because it is truly the threat in the Middle East, and we have to deal with that. You know, First Committee deals with a range of issues. If you saw my remarks that I made with regard on regional security, I mentioned our concerns about the JCPOA. So First Committee covers a range of issues. A number of countries raised their support for the agreement, which they have a right to do at First Committee, say whatever they want. But we also wanted to make the point that JCPOA is fundamentally flawed, needs to be fixed.
Thank you. I've got a number of questions.
Okay.
I hope you'll answer them. Shauna McGee from Kyoto News. Could you tell us why specifically the U.S. shifted position from last year with regards to the Japanese resolution? If I recall correctly, it was an abstention last year, and this year you co-sponsored it. That's one. And could you tell us about taking out the use of nuclear weapons and switching it to nuclear weapons use? What was involved in the negotiations on that and the significance of that? And then you were saying there was a lot of support with 144 countries backing it. We hear that it went down by quite a bit, a loss of from 70, I think it was, what was the co-sponsorship?
I think the loss is maybe
70, yeah, it was a reduction, and that's a different approach to what you're saying, so could you speak to that?
no, thank you for the questions. The first question, just briefly again, as I wrote it down, but I didn't have the complete.
Abstention, the shift of the U.S. position, what was behind the?
Yeah, last year the resolution, in our view, did not reflect what we believe to be the fundamental security environment that we were dealing with, and didn't embrace this concept of the need to create the conditions for nuclear disarmament. This year's resolution, clearly the Japanese, and I think, I can't speak for them, but I think they were very, very concerned about North Korea. And if you notice the paragraph on CTBT, it was very clear that they were looking at this from the standpoint of, if you are eventually going to have this treaty ratified, you have to deal with the fundamental imminent threat to the treaty, which is the continued testing by North Korea. So this year's resolution clearly was a much, much stronger resolution. As I said earlier, a snapshot of what the disarmament landscape is like. And so those were the differences between last year, this year. A number of countries decided that to abstain, that didn't abstain last year on that. That was their choice. I think a number of them wanted to continue to support language that had been agreed upon in the past in a number of areas. The problem with that is that, for example, on CTBT, they're still using language and supporting language from over 20 years ago, from when the treaty was first negotiated and then opened for signature. And it doesn't reflect today's reality. And I think the Japanese, the paragraph in the Japanese resolution with regard to CTBT was very clear as to what the threat is and is reality. And so were they going to lose some support for taking a much more practical, realistic approach? So be it. I think 144 countries, I think that was right, that supported it. That's a majority of countries felt that that resolution reflected and was a snapshot of where we are today, what the threats are, and frankly, what the international community needs to do. On the use, I really don't want to get into the negotiations. Japan had negotiations with a number of countries, and I think at the end of the day, we got there was a good resolution put on the table that majority of the international community could support.
Get into the, would you explain the nuance of the shift from the use of to nuclear use? Are you able to?
It wouldn't be right for me to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Please.
Hi, I'm Dulcie Linebaugh from Pass Blue. I wanted to go back to the JCPOA and ask you what you're doing, the State Department is doing with Congress in these discussions and outside Congress, and the nature of the discussions.
Well, it wouldn't be, again, right for me to talk about conversations the department is having with members of Congress on this issue. We are engaging, and not just the State Department, but the White House, other elements of the U.S. government with Congress on this issue. It's a very, there are lots of views on this. agreement outside of the administration. And so, look, the president's decision made it very clear that, Congress has a decision to make with regard to this agreement. You can either do nothing, you can either reimpose sanctions, or you can fix the agreement. By that I mean amending the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. So the president was in no way advocating that we should get out of the JCPOA. But what he wants is to have the agreement fixed so it deals with some of the issues that I raised in response to Benny's question about Iran's malignant behavior in a number of areas. So these conversations will be ongoing, but we will be strongly encouraging Congress to amend the Iran Nuclear Review, the Iran Nuclear Review Act, Nuclear Agreement Review Act. Sorry about that. Yeah. So.
How would that amendment, what would that process look like?
Well, it's hard for me to tell you what that's going to look like when Congress hasn't made a decision yet to do that. So, yeah, that would be premature of me to speculate. Sir.
Hi, we meet for the first time, Ambassador Wood. Kambiz Forohar from Bloomberg.
Pleasure.
There were a number of resolutions dealing with space and militarization of space, and the U.S. was frequently isolated by it. I think Georgia and the U.S. and Israel were.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the thinking behind that?
Well, the thinking behind it is that the Russians and Chinese have been proposing for some time the idea of negotiating a ban on weapons in outer space. And the treaty that they put forward is flawed in a number of aspects. One of which, the most important thing is there's no definition of what is a space weapon. There is no fundamental definition of that. Their draft treaty also doesn't deal with the question of terrestrial-based anti-satellite weapons. This is a technology that the Russians and the Chinese are working on feverishly, and they don't address that issue in their treaty. And so the Russians, realizing that there's probably there's some concern about trying to negotiate a legally binding instrument on this right now. They put forward this no first placement resolution, which there's no way to independently, again, show or prove that a country is actually adhering to it. Doesn't address the whole space. What is this, a space weapon? And so it's also quite interesting that the Russians are pushing this. It actually should be no second placement treaty because back in the 1970s, the Soviet Union put into place co-orbital ASAT technology. So the Russians are being a bit, how should I say, they like to play games with regard to space. And so we've been able to work with them on technical confidence building measures with regard to outer space. And we co-sponsored a resolution with them. They got a lot of support from the international community. We think that's the best way to address these issues. But by trying to put forward a treaty that also isn't verifiable, that isn't equitable, and doesn't protect the interests of the United States and its allies, is not something we can support. But we can and have worked together with Russia on how we can improve trust and confidence building with regard to outer space.
Was that a resolution or?
Well, actually, they have the TCBM is a resolution that they've run in the past. We supported last year and we did this year.
What is TCBM?
It's called Technical Confidence Building Measures. Yeah. Sir.
Bing Xin Li from People's Daily. There are some sayings that South Korea and Japan are also considering develop the nuclear arms in a short period of time if DPRK go too fast. So I wonder why it is not premature. It is premature to have a nuclear disarmament.
I'm sorry, nuclear.
Nuclear disarmament.
You're saying why I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the last part.
Yeah, why you said it's premature, it's not mature.
Right. Well, first of all, I don't think Japan or South Korea have made any decisions about the whole question of whether they would want to acquire nuclear weapons. They are in an umbrella alliance with the United States. We work closely and cooperate closely to deal with the threat of North Korea. And so they know our position, and as far as I'm aware, there is no movement afoot to change their policy with regard to nuclear deterrence by seeking their own independent nuclear capability. But the fact that there are all of these discussions going on about how we deal with the threat from North Korea, it just tells you that you can't, as some in the nuclear disarmament would like to see happen, for countries to give up their nuclear weapons and not only that, but in essence remove the nuclear umbrella that they provide for a number of countries. In this kind of environment, it's just not realistic to expect that any country is, particularly the United States, is going to give up its nuclear weapons and allow the crazy man in Pyongyang to have his nuclear capability. It's just absurd to think that that's going to happen. But it's not just North Korea that is of concern, and I mentioned the other concerns that the United States has. So I think that's the best way I can answer your question.
You mentioned South China Sea issues. Is that issue is related to the nuclear disarmament?
No, what I was talking about is, well, it's related in the sense that the environment right now in the international arena is very volatile. And we've made no secret that some of the activities that China has been engaged in the South China Sea do not help improve the current global climate. And so, again, it's tensions in that region, on the Korean Peninsula, the Middle East, Russian activities in Europe. This is not the time to talk about nuclear disarmament until you can deal with some of these conflicts and issues that I've outlined. To ignore these issues as if they don't exist and that countries should just go ahead, sign a ban treaty, ratify it, and disarm, it's just not realistic. And I deal in the real world. Some of the ban proponents, they're dealing in some parallel universe. Please.
Without Franco with NHK. I know this might be a little bit of a broader question, but can you give us a sense of what's next in terms of nuclear disarmament for the U.S.? You know, we see the nuclear treaty, many the countries that were championing it were saying it's because they're frustrated because of the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament. So, you know, what's next? What can you give the international community, and what are you foreseeing it's going to happen in policy? Any proposals, any...
Well, part of the, no, it's a good question. What we're going through right now is a policy review in a number of areas related to nuclear disarmament, arms control, and nonproliferation. So I'm not able to tell you what we will or will not do. But what we have been saying to a number of our colleagues is that we are committed to living up to our Article 6 obligations under the NPT. We've made that very clear. We have been taking steps. We've been supporting, of course, the New START agreement. We have also we're now looking at a wide range of policies, but the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty is something that the U.S. has previously supported. We've been taking a number of steps. The one thing that I point to over and over again is that if you look at back in 1967, which was the height of the Cold War, we had well over 32,000 nuclear weapons. Today we're down to a little bit more than 4,400. That represents an 87% reduction, which I think when you read the text of Article 6, where it talks about a good faith commitment to disarmament, I would think an 87% reduction demonstrates good faith since 1967, which is right before the NPT came into force. So that's the best way I can answer this question. I don't have anything new to offer you because, again, we're still undertaking a number of reviews on some of these policy matters. But if you look at the U.S. track record, I think it speaks for itself about our commitment to nuclear disarmament.
Follow up on one thing, sorry. What do you make of this agreement between China and South Korea on deployment of THAAD? That basically South Korea foreign minister said that they won't participate in any connected missile defense system. Is that a tweak in South Korea's agreement with the U.S. to, go aggressive on missile defense?
Well, for one thing, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speak to an agreement between, two sovereign states like that. I mean, I don't have the details of it. What I have said to my Chinese counterpart many times is that that is a reality, and you need to accept that.
That means
That yeah.
is a reality.
Yeah. And again, hard to me to speak to the agreement, but we have a very strong alliance with the Republic of Korea, and that alliance has only grown stronger as the threat from North Korea has grown in proportion. So, yeah, that's the best way I can answer that. That's an agreement. You'll have to ask, representatives of both governments about it. But I've seen the press reports.
But it concerns the U.S. The U.S. is running the show.
No, well, we're not running any show, but we don't have any concerns about it because, frankly, our alliance with the ROK is strong and sound, and as I said, getting stronger every day as this threat from North Korea continues to grow.
Nice picture.
Good photographer.
Two questions. First, on the status of the demilitarization of outer space, where are things now? So this resolution passed and the treaty is still on hold. And in terms of the Conference on Disarmament itself, which has been deadlocked forever, is there any chance at all that this deadlock is going to be broken and that it might actually do something?
Those are good questions, Edie. First, with regard to demilitarization of outer space, this resolution, since I've been here, it is the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. The resolution has been voted on and approved by large numbers, but there have been a significant number of states who have said, wait a minute, we know what Russia and China are doing. We're not going to support that. I mean, I don't know that it goes anywhere. We have made very clear to the Russians our opposition to this treaty, and I think a number of countries have also done that, made their concerns known, and I think a number of countries, seeing that the U.S. and many others are opposed to it, realize that it's going nowhere. Now, with regard to the CD, the deadlock, it has been a major problem. We have tried in the past to put forward some ideas for breaking the deadlock, and we haven't been able to do so, and it's been frustrating for everyone in the CD. But many like to blame the CD for the fact that nothing has happened in the body, and it has nothing to do with the actual machinery itself. It's really the political will or the lack thereof that has prevented any progress from being made in the CD. So there's been discussion about, the CD should go away, it should stop being funded, we should get rid of it. The CD was designed to be a place where you can negotiate disarmament agreements and still be able to protect your national security interest. And that's why the rule of consensus is so important. And many countries, including my own, feel that if you're going to have discussions of very sensitive national security topics and have potential negotiations, you need to be able to preserve that ability to block a negotiation if it's in any way threatening your national security interests. The problem today is that the consensus rule has been abused by some, not dealing with the questions of substance, but questions of procedure. And as a result, we haven't been able to even get to the point of having a discussion about whether to enlarge the CD, because there are a number of states that want to be a part of the CD and cannot. But so that's just an example. So I don't know, and I don't see how the deadlock gets broken anytime soon, but we will certainly work very hard, as we have been, to try to come up with creative ideas to try to break this logjam.
To follow up on my previous question,
Sure.
in the disarmament community, how is the whole issue of defensive weapons being dealt with? I mean, obviously the Chinese see THAAD and other systems as threat. Russia always says, remember the old days when they demanded to remove it from the Czech Republic and so. So there's two views. How is it being dealt with in there?
Well, it's the Russians.
The weapon, or is it the defense?
Well, you'll have to ask those who raise this issue constantly, like Russia and China. I think, look, we have said ballistic missile defenses are stabilizing. They're not destabilizing, they're stabilizing. And we have tried to work closely with Russia on the whole issue of ballistic missile defense. They don't seem to be interested in having that kind of discussion, except to try to score political points in various fora on the issue. But the threat from, as an example, the threat from ballistic missiles is growing. We've seen with North Korea, we see with Iran, and there are other countries that are pursuing this kind of technology. And we have to be able to defend ourselves and do what's necessary to protect our peoples and our allies. So instead of having a constructive conversation about this issue, Russia and to some extent China try to politicize the issue and say that it threatens their strategic nuclear deterrence. And we have said to them over and over again, for example, with THAAD, it does not threaten your strategic nuclear deterrent. And it's very interesting, too, about the Russians' concerns about ballistic missile defense. They have a number of interceptors surrounding Moscow that we don't complain about. And so I think, again, a lot of it is political posturing, and just the Russians, as they typically do here at First Committee, try to score a lot of cheap political points. And they're not very good at it, to be very honest.
Well, cheap is good.
On Syria, what are you expecting to happen?
I'm expecting that there will be a vote on the resolution that has been put forward by Poland, and I think it is very good and a very strong resolution, and our hats go off to the Polish delegation here for putting forward a very balanced, straightforward resolution. And I would expect that if there is a vote today on that proposal, that it will get overwhelming support. And so we saw yesterday Russia was trying to put off discussion of this issue, or put off any movement on this issue until next year. And you can see it's just another example of Russia trying to protect the regime in Damascus. We saw that the recent veto of the Jim extension. So this is a clear pattern of behavior on the part of those who support Syria. And my hope is that the Russians will not try any parliamentary procedures to avoid having this resolution taken up today.
But could that happen?
I don't know. We'll have to see. I don't know what they may try, but I think it would likely fail. And yesterday, when the Russian representative proposed this, I immediately took to the floor to express my firm opposition to any idea of putting off any action on this resolution.
What's the parliamentary procedure there? I mean, what's the...
Well,
how does it work?
It's a complicated... I don't think you all want to sit here and listen to me talk about potential things. And I certainly want to give the Russians any ideas. So
You're going to tell them immediately afterwards.
We're running over to court. Tell them right now.
I don't know, but it will be interesting to see. I think there would be a lot of opposition if they were to try to do that. And I think they would be underestimating the level of support for a strong condemnation from the First Committee representatives a condemnation of Syrian activity, Syrian attacks against its own people. So
Who's going to support the Russians?
the usual suspects that support Russia and, in this particular case, Syria. I mean, you all know them as well as I do. Don't need to name them.
The status of the Jim mandate and Russia's position.
Well, the Jim mandate is still valid until I think it's November 15 or 16. Yeah, so we'll just have to see. But what Russia tries to do today will be an indication of what they may decide to do in the future, but I don't know.
They plan to look at the report on November 7th in the Security Council.
Well, one of the things that you all should be aware of, I'm just looking at my watch here, the Jim, yes, the Jim report is out. It was out as of 9 a.m. this morning, so.
Yeah, but they say that it hasn't been translated yet to Russian, and they don't speak English, so.
And that's why they weren't officially responding.
Yeah. Well, he responded to me last night in English, so
What did he
the
say?
Russian representative speaks very, very
Which
good
one?
English. This is Yermakov.
Oh, yeah, okay.
All the representatives from Russia, they understand English quite well. They do. But we'll see. But frankly, those of you who have read the Jim report realize that this is very important, and you can understand why Russia is doing everything that it possibly can to avoid dealing with this question. So, okay.
We
Anything?
only have time for maybe one or two more questions.
I think they've, please.
So, given the tensions from the nuclear ban treaty group, what is the U.S. trying to do to work with them, if anything?
Oh, we have tried to work with them. We've tried to engage them on how serious the international environment is right now, and that trying to take steps like a ban treaty only serve to exacerbate the tensions. This ban treaty, we've said, will undermine the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime. They haven't been interested in a dialogue. What they're interested in is getting this ban treaty. And again, I'll repeat, the ban treaty will not reduce nuclear weapons stockpiles by one single weapon. And not only that, but if you look at the number of countries that actually signed the treaty, it was a lot fewer than they had expected. And when you look at how many have ratified it, it's only been, I think, 3. It tells you that, you know, one of the things that we've been doing is telling countries, read the fine print here. Understand what this potentially means for security cooperation with the United States and your other partners who may be involved in a nuclear alliance, part of a nuclear alliance. So I think it's one thing adopting it here in New York in July, but when you sign something and ratify it, it becomes a legal obligation. And I think a number of countries have decided that this may be a step too far for them. And again, maybe a few more will sign as time goes on, but I'm not sure. I think all the countries that wanted to sign it have done so, and the others that haven't are probably, you know, taking a real hard look at that treaty and what it means for example, if they have security cooperation with the United States, what it would mean to that ability to cooperate with us on things. So.
Last question on the NPT.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in negotiations? What's happening, if anything, ever on the negotiations on a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East?
Well, this has been a perennial question. Where we are is that we have said we are happy to support, we the U.S. are happy to support any initiative coming from the region. The problem is some in the region want the depositories, meaning the U.S., United Kingdom, and Russia, to impose something. And we have said, as long as it represents the views of all countries in the region, that it is not exclusive, that it doesn't try to isolate one particular country or more than one country, we're willing to work with them. But that has to come from, it has to emanate from the region. And the problem is that some Arab countries want to impose a solution, a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the region without taking into account all of the views and security concerns of all the countries in the region. So I see no real movement on this issue right now. My hope is that countries such as Egypt will not try to hijack the 2020 NPT review conference over this issue. Certainly, I don't think majority of NPT states will want that to happen, but we'll have to see. It will really be up to the small handful of countries, it's actually smaller than a handful, that are trying to impose a solution on the region, and that's not something that we can accept.
Well, I wish we had more time, unfortunately, but he can't be late for his meeting across the street.
Yeah, you know what that meeting is.
So with that, I want to thank Ambassador Wood so much for coming today. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah,
We will turn a transcript around as soon as we can and send it out to you shortly. And with that,
Just a quick one. Do you know how long approximately that might be? A couple of
we hope
hours?
it'll be a couple of hours.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that
Thank
helps
you.
us for deadlines.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I hope so
How many
because
have ratified
there's,
the
as
nuclear
far as I know, the
disarmament
Secretary's not speaking this morning.
He said
so
all
3.
he's
Okay,
talking, then our
then
transcript
good.
gets on.